Evening to those who are with us thus far, and welcome to this Institute of Economic Affairs webinar. I'm Annabel Denham. I'm Director of Communications at the IEA. I'm joined today by two distinguished guests, Vicky Pryce and Kate Andrews. By way of brief introduction, Vicky is Chief Economics Advisor at the CEBR and former Joint Head of the UK Government Economic Service. She is author of Greekonomics, Prisonomics, and It's the Economy, Stupid? But the reason we are here today is to discuss her fourth book, Women versus Capitalism. Kate Andrews is the economics correspondent at the Spectator, having previously worked as Associate Director here at the IEA and also at the Adam Smith Institute. Kate has authored a number of reports, but perhaps most pertinent to this conversation are her briefings on gender pay gap reporting. The central thesis in Vicky's book is that there is a serious market failure in our current capitalist model, which Vicky argues systematically discriminates against women in the workplace and at home, largely because of its ingrained short-termism. Some biases that women face, Vicky concedes, are unconscious, but not all. With women's jobs mostly bunched in the intermediate and lower skilled areas, things are unlikely to get better as robotics increasingly displace those activities, unless, as Vicky argues, government intervenes. But I will hand over to Vicky now to fill you in on the solutions that she proposes and to talk a little bit more about the issues that women face today. Vicky, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and you've summarised it very well. So I'll just say a few things really about what got me to write the book. I'm an economist, as you said, and of course, there's been the Me Too movement, feminism, which has been around for quite some time, sort of redefining itself, if you like, and emerging slightly differently, but it's been with us for some time now. And they have all brought out the imbalance that exists between men and women in terms of the power that there is, so that the man exercises over the woman generally, and the fact that, of course, that they are the ones who hold most of the wealth, and it's the women who hold a lot less. And that, of course, defines the way in which we operate in the market. What I'm arguing, though, is that there is a real case for ensuring gender equality, not only because of fairness issues, which the Me Too and the feminist arguments would suggest anyway, but much more because, from my perspective, all those things are very important, but much more because it actually helps the economy do considerably better. If you don't use your resources properly, if there is a misallocation of resources because they're not priced properly, then you end up with a suboptimal situation. So you can justify quite a lot of what the Me Too movement and the feminist movement is saying by looking at the economics too. So it's not just a nice to have, but a must have. And that's basically where I'm coming from. And I'm arguing that the market mechanism doesn't send out the right pricing signals for that to happen. It works a little bit like climate change. So if you didn't have a proper price for carbon, as we don't, you would tend to produce, just to please your own production processes and whatever it is that you want to get at the end of the day in terms of profits, not worrying about what it would mean for the people who live next door and for the wider climate, of course, and the way in which one is polluting the atmosphere and leads to long-term problems for all of us. So those are externalities which are not captured by the prices that those producers have to pay for their inputs and for just simply being allowed to produce. And it's a little bit like that with women. There isn't anything that tells one particular firm that if I'm undervaluing, underpaying a particular woman or not using her to the right skills level, I'm actually having an impact which is much wider than that, because women tend to stay in those positions, they get ghettoized in low pay jobs, and they don't contribute to their skill levels. And the reason why they don't, of course, is because there are a number of obstacles around. These are the market failures that you mentioned, Annabel, which are really important. If there are obstacles to any resource, any input into the production process, then obviously it looks like the cost of that is higher than it would otherwise be. So you tend not to bother having them as part of your production process. You look elsewhere, somewhere easy, where you can just find people who are already willing and able to do the work you want to do without necessarily needing or wanting or being able to afford to invest a little bit more heavily in women or in another bit of the resource areas that you can have instead coming into your production process. So those obstacles that exist all across the world, and what I've done in the book is I haven't focused just on the UK and the US and the developed world. There are many. So the World Bank and the National Monetary Fund, we look at this, come up with a list, and the World Bank every year, of countries and obstacles that are put in their way. There are only a handful of countries that can be counted in the fingers of just one hand, which don't have any restrictions on women's working, who at least treat them as equal, even though there are still quite a lot of unconscious biases around that prevent them from doing the right thing. So those obstacles can be, they don't have any property rights, they're not allowed to work in particular areas, particular sectors, they can't travel to work far, they can't work particular hours, they need to get permission to work by their husbands, they have no bank accounts. So all those issues are against them. Or they're made to perhaps marry early. It's very, very interesting when you look at cases of early marriage and how that seriously affects growth of the economy as a whole. So those obstacles are there, and they don't allow you to contribute fully in the labour market. And every change that has happened in women's participation, and therefore their contribution to the economy, which has become fuller as the years have passed, have happened because of government intervention. In other words, some regulations were either removed, and you can see the impact even if you look at regions within the same country, in Africa, for example, how that quickly results in the women participating in the labour force a lot more than before, and senior women appearing that can also act as role models and decision makers, which is so important. So you could remove some of the regulations, but in the Western world, you had to also impose some. And those are regulations that to do with equal pay, equal opportunity, employment rights, maternity pay, and then, of course, provision of childcare, which is happening in a number of countries. So we still, unfortunately, don't have full participation by women to the extent that they would like it. Of course, they can make a choice, but if they make a choice because they want to, it's different to making a choice because you have no other choice but to stay at home and look after your children or not get trained properly for the future. And the result is that women, on average, earn a lot less during their lifetime in the Western world, and certainly elsewhere too. They end up, because of that, by the time they reach pension age, having only a fifth of the pension wealth of a man. They are much more likely to fall into poverty because they end up in jobs which are quite precarious, very low paid, and of course many of them part-time. Women choose because of those obstacles and the lack of flexibility in the workplace that we've had until now. COVID-19 might change this quite significantly. Let's see what happens. But they're the ones who end up working in jobs and in part-time occupations where the part-time pay gap between those who work part-time and those who work full-time, males in particular, is something in the UK like 35%. 43% of women work part-time in the UK, of all the women who are in the labour force, whereas only 13% of men do. That tends to just accentuate this wage and earnings gap that exists throughout their lives and pushes women down at the lower end of the income earning. So my recommendations include quotas for women in senior positions so that you have more senior women over a period of time in occupations that others can see and want to emulate. So there are more senior models that one can look at. A lot of state provision and local authority provision and possibly also company provision for childcare. In fact, free childcare would make a huge difference. And also forcing firms very much to alter the whole recruitment mechanism that they have in place to eliminate all those barriers that exist, which in the West are much more unconscious, if you like, but also conscious ones that people can get away with. So a lot more enforcement of some of the regulations that are out there, and certainly for the rest of the world, elimination of those barriers that exist, which, as I was saying before, the international organizations are pushing very hard for. I'll stop here and perhaps listen to what Kate has to say.
Thanks very much, Vicky. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Annabel, and thanks, Vicky. So I think it's helpful in the context of this discussion to discuss what capitalism has done for women and not totally separate it, but draw that out and then talk about what capitalism is doing for women. Because I think if you try to frame it as women versus capitalism, you overlook the just incredible role that capitalism has played in improving women's lives. Vicky mentioned that when women have found themselves more liberated, it's been because of state intervention. I don't think that's the case, and I'll come back to this. But I mean, in terms of real specifics here, you know, one of the biggest achievements that has allowed women to be liberated from the lives that they used to live and to have autonomy over their body and their finances and what they do with their lives comes down to a single individual, Catherine McCormick, who single-handedly financed the development of the contraceptive pill when the US government refused to do so, when the state wouldn't aid in that process. A feminist woman decided that she, with her private money and in a private capacity, would push forward with scientists and do so. And from the pill to the dishwasher, it has been these innovations, medical and technological, that have been discovered and spread through market forces that have allowed us to largely liberate physically, financially, and the rest. And those are achievements that, you know, are very women specific, but I think we can't separate women out from the men, from all people who have benefited from over 1 billion people rising out of absolute poverty in the past 30 years alone, thanks to the power of market forces. You know, when markets empower people, they're empowering women as well. And it's thanks to this wealth that's been accumulated very often in more developed countries, but by no means solely, that has allowed for funding around medicine, to address issues around pregnancy. Women are no longer given death sentences if they're going to give birth. We have so much more control around what happens to us, where we work, where we choose to live, and what we do. And if we are to dare compare capitalist countries to an alternative, catastrophic alternatives that have been tried over the past century, there is no comparison. There is no indicator that you can find on human well-being that would favor the Soviet Union or East Germany or today's Venezuela over capitalist countries. There have been some terrifying attempts to claim that Stalin and Mao were kind to women because they offered free childcare, but in reality, these are men who enslaved them, took away their most basic rights, did not provide them with even the most basic kinds of medical necessities, and inflicted mass rape and execution. So, you know, I think we have to look at this in the context that capitalism is the only system so far that has genuinely liberated women, and actually historically such a short period of time. Now, by no means is it perfect. And I think Vicky and I would agree that in many areas of the world and on specific issues here in the UK and in the developed world, there are things that we need to overcome. Liberal democracies, in many ways, have provided those basic rights for women, but developing countries, in many ways, have not. And Vicky mentions that. Now, I think we still have to be a bit careful here. Economists on the left and the right would agree that, as awful as it is to talk about and look at, getting women out of the fields and out of often sex work and into factories in, say, Bangladesh is still a step in the right direction. But by no means do we celebrate this or think that women around the world are treated equally. It's simply not the case. So I think Vicky and I will agree on that. There's plenty of liberal democracy and, frankly, free market capitalism to bring to these places. Often the women who aren't allowed to drive, as Vicky says, aren't allowed to work, are not living in real free market societies. There may be some capitalist aspect, but it's often controlled by the state, and there's extreme intervention on the state's part into the economy and into people's lives. It looks nothing like the UK. So where Vicky and I think really differ is on the issues that are faced by women in the West, modern women, when it comes to our daily lives. Again, to go back to areas of agreement, I think flexible work has been an outstanding issue that really affects women who want to continue to work and also want to bring up a family. And no doubt the COVID crisis has pushed us quite dramatically into an age where that's going to be more on offer. But we have to recognize that companies are moving in that direction anyway. It's often the big companies, the ones that are accused of being, you know, too capitalist, too corporate, too profit driven, that offer the most generous benefits to women, childcare on site, a year's worth or plus of maternity pay. It's those smaller businesses that struggle to afford it, but it's also those smaller businesses that are seeing more and more women become entrepreneurs and run those businesses. It's now, I think, roughly, Annabel can correct me, I know she knows her stuff on this, roughly 30 to 35% of small businesses in the UK are now female run. And I think as the basic change in demographics and the way that things have changed so much over the past 30 years, and women coming into the workplace, in some cases dominating and changing and taking over, means that we are becoming more female friendly just based on that demographic change alone, just based on the changes in higher education where more women are going to university, becoming trained, becoming skilled, and going into jobs that 40 or 50 years ago they wouldn't have been considered for. And the data, say, on the gender pay gap in older age groups is still reflecting those education and work decisions that were made in an era that I think a lot of younger women and modern women just can't relate to. I would push back on the gender pay gap narrative. Very often these are very crude statistics that are worse than useless because they're not even calculating like for like or telling us much about pay gap issues. They're creating often bad incentives for employers to focus on their pay gap first and foremost, and not on what their employees, male and female, actually want. So Vicky talked about the gap between men and women in part-time work and full-time work, but she didn't mention the pay gap. Women in part-time work on average are earning roughly 4% more than men. Now in full-time work, men on average earn roughly 9% more. In the age brackets between 22 and 40, it's in the margin of error, but things are dramatically changing here. And I'm loath to point my finger at employers. Of course, there are select ones who you have to take to the employment tribunal, but I'm loath to point my finger at employers who are actually, on the whole, very keen to promote women, get them onto their boards, but face those cultural challenges of not having the women to select from. So I guess I just wrap up on the point about childcare. And this country is just really horrible proof that the more free childcare you try to offer, the more of a vicious cycle you create in which costs continue to rise for any parent that needs more childcare than what the state is subsidizing. And actually, childcare is very inaccessible because the state has played such a large role in this country, because regulations are so strict. And Vicky said you need state intervention to liberate women because they have to change the laws. Well, that is one way to look at it, but really, I think a lot of people would look at that from a different perspective. When the state rolls back laws, when the state gives people the, grants really the wrong word, just recognizes that there are universal human rights that people should be able to have. What it's doing is saying we need more individualism, we need more market, we need more capitalism, and we need less government. We need to get out of the way. So I guess it's a technicality that they have to sign on the dotted line. But, really that is a testament to the fact that if you want to liberate women, you need to give them choices. So I'm sure we're going to discuss that more, so I'll stop there. But I think that the fundamental role that capitalism has played in liberating women and giving us opportunity is just immense. And whilst I would never want to pretend that we still can't make some positive changes, I don't think we should scoff at what has happened over the past century, because it's truly incredible where we were and where we've come.
Great, thanks very much, Kate. I do want to come on to some of Vicky's proposed solutions, and of course want to discuss the gender pay gap, the motherhood penalty and childcare in this country, and whether government regulation is what's needed to truly empower women. But first I'd like to address the COVID-19 crisis. We know that crises can impact some groups more than others and amplify inequalities or perceived inequalities. In the UK today, many women work in retail, hospitality, miscellaneous services where pay is low. Many of these jobs could be lost forever after the pandemic. So I'd like to ask you both whether you think coronavirus will stunt women's progress, because of course you've both mentioned how flexible and remote working was a pre-existing trend, but it's one that's being accelerated by this pandemic. Do you think that the crisis is going to reinforce gender stereotypes because women are more likely to be in part-time work, and with schools and nurseries shut, it might make financial financial sense for them to take on the unpaid caring responsibilities, or do you think that it could actually boost progress made because it will normalise home working? Vicky, I'll come to you first.
Well, we seem to have gone backwards, and I think the evidence suggests there's a PwC survey that said that 78% of the job losses have been on women, and quite a lot of them on younger women, and quite a lot of young people, of course, have suffered from this. And indeed, you're absolutely right, because the way that you phrase the question, quite a lot of women do exactly as I said, in the sense that they work in occupations which give them that flexibility, but also are very low paid. So they're the ones likely to be hit most. Of course, you have all these women who work in the care sector right now and in National Health Service, and they've also been affected by illnesses and the type of dreadful work that they've had to do, for which we applaud them every week. In fact, we applaud them all the time. But what you find also is that, yes, this motherhood issue is a very important one, in the sense that indeed women have gone back to minding their kids, and because they are the ones who have been earning less. If the household had to decide who gets on furlough and who continues working, or who sort of steps back from what they were doing to support the children who don't go to school, so the other half can carry on working, it tends to be the woman, because she earns less, so household incomes aren't that much affected. And it's quite interesting, because when you look at that, you immediately see the connection between women low pay, and I'll get back to some of the issues that Kate was talking about on the overall figures. They tend to congregate, women, it's not just the pay gap, they congregate very much in the low paid areas. And then of course you have to see what you're comparing. I'm comparing like with like. The law says you need to look at equivalent jobs, and the BBC has been a very good case in point that we can perhaps discuss as well in a little while. But what you see is that the higher your income, your average earnings in the year, the more likely you are to be able to work from home. This is exactly what's happened. And the lower your income is, the less likely you are. There's been studies looking at the UK, the US, and it just gets replicated everywhere. So it is the women, it is the low paid who are the ones who have suffered most. And of course, they do jobs which are very customer facing, and they're the ones who have seriously lost out. And everyone is talking about scarring, and in other words, what will happen to all the people who lose their jobs, and when they get back, are they going to have had the training that they need to move into different areas? Are they going to ever get back to their wage trajectory that they're going to have otherwise? And the answer is it will take them a long time, and they may never do so. So COVID has really shown that this type of inequality we already had is, if anything, at times of crisis, accentuated. And if you look at what the IMF says, because they have been producing various papers now, they think in every recession it's the women who suffer most. And also, of course, with the introduction of AI. I mean, that's a very interesting one that you raised, the technology one, because what we find, particularly now with COVID and the type of virus and how it spreads through human contact, as we know. That's why we should be wearing masks and all that sort of stuff. And we had lockdown for a while. So obviously what firms will be doing is trying to eliminate that contact by putting more machines. We had already seen such a big reduction in the number of people working in the retail sector over the last few years. The expectation this year, even without COVID, was that we were going to lose 170,000 retail jobs. The majority of those would have been on women. So women are therefore much more likely to fall into poverty than men, because of where they start, and the cuts in their wages, of course, or losing their job pushes them even further into it. So I think COVID is a very good and very sad example of why we should not let such a large group of people be the most vulnerable ones in society.
Okay, what's your view on that? You gave sort of cause for optimism in your introductory remarks. What do you think the impact of COVID-19 will be on women's progress?
Well, I take the point about homeschooling. I think that is one of the biggest concerns, that we know that regardless of the job or the income of a man and a woman in a partnership, the housework and childcare almost always disproportionately falls on the women, and there's some pretty strong studies to back that up. So there'd be no reason to think that would be different in the time of COVID, and I'm sure that is detracting from women's opportunities at work to some extent. But I think in terms of the jobs themselves, it might be a bit more of a nuanced picture. So data from the ONS at the end of last month showed the proportion of businesses laying off staff in the short term to cope with the impact of COVID. And the construction industry was at the top of well over 60%. Transportation was up there, waste management was up there, as was wholesale and retail trade. Now, some of those industries are disproportionately dominated by men and some by women. And so there's a real mix there. Also, at the bottom, the industries that were likely to be safest, you have social work and education. And again, those are much more likely to be women. So I think that you see a bit of a mixed picture here. It'll be very interesting to see what happens to part-time work. I think Vicky is right that it can be less stable, and the less you earn, the less likely it is that you can work from home. A lot of those jobs do tend to be face-to-face in retail and so on. So there is a real vulnerability there. But as we go back to work, with these new social distancing measures that companies and government are negotiating right now to bring in, it seems very unlikely that most shops, offices are going to be able to open at full capacity. And I actually think you could see a real uptick in part-time work. The government's plans to change the furloughing scheme so that people can work part-time from August really suggests that there's some internal agreement on that part-time work is going to be here in a wider way for more employees for at least a good chunk of time. So people who are already in that line of work may find it slightly easier to keep their jobs if their employers know that they don't have to commit to them 5 days a week, but only have to commit to them 2 days a week. So, I mean, I'm not making a prediction. I just think it's going to be interesting to see where the axe falls, probably in August and September when those really difficult choices start getting made.
Thanks very much. Now, we've had some really interesting questions come up on the Q&A. One of them sort of focuses on choice. It says, can you give some examples of obstacles faced exclusively by women in the developed world? I hear a lot about institutional oppression suffered by women, but have trouble putting my finger on a specific tangible example which cannot be explained by choice. I mean, I think a good example of this is the fact that even in the most socially liberal and progressive societies in the world, namely in Scandinavia, women are still heavily underrepresented in STEM subjects and overrepresented in humanities. Is this a square that we need to circle? Is what we're really doing offering women, does freedom and wealth give women more choice? Vicky, can I come to you first?
Yes, on the developing countries, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, there are obstacles, as I said earlier, in terms of working in particular sectors, the distance you can travel, and so on. But also, whether the culture is such that it allows you to work in particular environments, or even out of your house. So there are still huge restrictions. So in a number of those places, you have a capitalist system, but the women face all these obstacles which prevent them from doing the right thing. And there was a very interesting statistic I saw recently. I was in some, I can't remember now, but there was somebody from Pakistan, a professor, who was saying that the interesting thing there is that the women outdo the men, the girls outdo the boys in terms of achievements, and they go to university, secondary education, tertiary education in larger numbers, and then they disappear from the workforce because they're not allowed to do those things. So of course, they can educate their children, so there is an intergenerational benefit to society of having more educated women. But if you don't have, this is the question then moving to Scandinavian countries, if you don't have enough women at the top who have made it in particular subjects, then you just don't get encouraged to go and do them yourself because you think there are going to be inhibitions there in terms of you being able to move forward. And it's very interesting about economists. I don't know how many economists are watching this. The interesting thing is that in most countries, when you look at STEM subjects, women don't do that badly. Many more women now do maths, strangely, even though we thought originally that they were completely put off by maths because it was a very male subject, but actually they take to it reasonably well, even though they don't do as much as the men do in some countries. But quite a lot of women do economics, but still it's a considerably lower number than the boys in this country. But once they make it to academia, economics seems to be the one subject where women find it hardest to get on and become professors. So we have a very small percentage of women professors here in the US and in Europe. And that has been the subject of loads of research trying to understand what it is. And there seems to be some serious bias which has come through this profession, which, Kate and I perhaps examples of that hasn't worked for us, but but it certainly does. But if we were in an academic environment, we find that that is actually hard. And there's been quite a lot looked at as to what happens. You do a joint paper with a man. It's the man who gets promoted and you don't. Your own papers get peer reviewed considerably harder than others peer review processes. So who are men. And so on. So they've now started not putting the gender, so that you see where that improves, and that improves hugely. And Kate mentioned before entrepreneurship and women running quite a lot of small businesses, which is absolutely true. But there again, Alison Rose, who now heads a bank I used to work for, the Royal Bank of Scotland, did this review before her elevation to show that how few women were in fact receiving sort of venture capital. They had to raise the money themselves mostly because they couldn't get funding, and that if they got similar types of funding and were viewed the same way as the men, then our GDP would be something like 250 billion higher a year. So we are losing out very significantly because of quite a lot of cultural issues here and in the developing world.
Kate, I would like to ask you to come back on that, but we have had an interesting question in the Q&A, which ties in quite neatly. It says in some countries, studies have shown that where paid paternity leave is optional, men who choose it voluntarily have been stigmatized in their workplace, far more so than women taking paid maternity leave. Is the problem really about societal attitudes to gender, in particularly gendered attitudes to domestic production and childcare? How can we change this when it comes down to persuading both men and women to think very differently and then educate their children differently? Is it something that regulation can achieve? And I think this fits in, neatly with what Vicky was saying about institutional bias. The VC sphere is an oft-cited example of this. Is this a problem, and do you think that regulation could solve it?
I think if there are major outstanding issues, especially in a place like the UK, around gender equality, they are almost completely cultural. And by that, I mean the way that society still has pretty narrow conceptions and views about the role, not of women in work, but of women at home. And I think that question speaks very well to that. Here in the UK, they brought in shared parental leave in 2015. The latest stats I've seen is that just over 2% of men who are eligible have actually used it. And that would go to suggest, well, it could suggest quite a few things, frankly. It could suggest that women don't want to give up their side of the leave. It could suggest that men have no interest in taking it up. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. And what we've seen in a place like Sweden, when they brought in shared parental leave decades ago, they found, after assessing it after 15, 20 years, that women were still taking most of the time off. And that's when they brought in what is essentially forced dad leave. You lose some of your benefits if men don't take a certain percentage of the time off. They did find, through that forceful measure, that more men took time off, but they still found disproportionately that women were taking a lot of that time. And so I think we have to be very delicate and balance this right. A lot of calls for more intervention and more regulation very often, I think, come down to legitimate cultural and societal frustrations that we still have. Anecdotal experiences that every woman who goes through the workplace will experience at some point, which feel sexist and aren't very enjoyable. For most women, this will be very few and far between, but it will happen, and it will usually come down to one individual who is backward-minded and just isn't where they should be in 2020. So I just think when we balance this out, it should always be trying to give people as much choice as possible. Vicky talked about the small number of female economics professors, and I find that to be interesting, and I don't know much about that. But I wonder, Vicky, and maybe you know, is it that the same number of women and men who put themselves forward for that job, more women got rejected? Or is it that by the time they got to the end of the education point where you could become a professor, there were fewer women to choose from? Because there is also a lot of research that shows that businesses are desperately trying to promote women into jobs in which historically there have been few women there. They often don't need a mandatory quota system to still desire that kind of gender diversity, because especially if they're a private company, they know it drives profit. And if they're a public company or nonprofit company, they still usually feel whatever their their ethical or moral causes, that having diversity on the board or within the university or whatever it is makes a meaningful difference. And so I think you also have to ask, what are the choices being made along the way that turn women off of certain decisions and turn them on to others? Maybe some of them are bad, maybe something has gone wrong, but also maybe in some cases it hasn't. There's the famous gender pay gap example is EasyJet, the fact that they have such a high gender pay gap, 53%. And that comes down to the fact that the majority of pilots are men and the majority of the aircrew are women, and the pilots get paid £100,000 a year and the women get paid anywhere between £25,000 to £40,000 a year. And then the question is, why aren't there more female pilots? And EasyJet has done everything it can. It's thrown the kitchen sink with its own profits and its own money at recruiting more female pilots, and they're just really struggling to. Obviously, this is before all flights were grounded. And we have to ask, what is happening in that process? But we can't just ask, why isn't it the case? Is it a bad thing that it's not the case? And I think it's just really hard to make sweeping statements about how culturally or in the workplace, there's all this bias against women. I think so much of it comes down to the very specific examples that we're talking about. And I would never reject the fact that women experience bias and sexism at different parts in their career. I think they do. But I think we're often very guilty of acting or manipulating the figures to make it sound like things are worse now than they were in the 1950s. And that's just obviously not the case either. It is the best time to be a woman in work. And actually, for a lot of young women in particular, there's a lot of opportunity if you're motivated to move up the work ladder.
Okay, well, if it was, you're making some very good points. If it was isolated cases, or maybe with EasyJet, maybe women don't like flying, or at least they don't like flying a plane for some weird reason. I don't know why. There are loads of women drivers, so I don't see why it should be different elsewhere. Then you could look at other sectors and say, oh, look, the majority of people everywhere else, or perhaps there's an equal balance across the economy where there isn't. So what you find is that women are not in senior positions across the board. There are very, very few exceptions. There are no sectors where there is pay equality. There is a pay gap in all of them, even the ones where there are many women working, where in fact there may also be in a majority, but they're not to the top level, and that is what the difference is. And if you're looking at why are there fewer academics somewhere, and is it because they didn't want to? You can just look at another example. I mentioned the BBC. Well, the interesting thing about regulation is that it allows you. And that's why it is so important to have the right regulation in the right place. It allows you to complain and take your employer to court if they don't pay you the equivalent wage. In other words, it doesn't have to be necessarily the person next door. It could be someone who does something completely different, but which can be deemed to be equivalent. So, for example, in the BBC, it was one person presenting in one area and someone else doing a different program, which they managed to argue is equivalent, and they were getting paid hugely less as a woman than the men. In fact, that was found to be the case across the board at the BBC, which had to report as a public body of sorts, had to report, or decided to report at the time of the pay reviews, what it was paying its top people. And it was a shock to everybody when it came out how much the men were making. And the interesting thing is that the initial reaction of the BBC was, well, let's cut what the men are getting paid. Rather than saying, oh my God, we should have been paying you all this, you women, you're just as good as the man, let's up your pay. And that's why the women in the end took them to court or accepted settlements. But it can happen at lower down too. So it's not just within an organization, it's also the types of things you do. Actually, it is within an organization. If you look at a council, so as we know, there have been some very good cases in Birmingham, for example, where the cleaners in the council took the council to court because they were getting paid a lot less than the rubbish collectors, who were all men and who were getting an awful lot more, I think twice as much at least. And they won, which of course means the payment of billions of pounds back to them at some point in the future. It's happened in supermarkets, Tesco, for example, similar. Women who work on the in the store against the men who work in the warehouses where the food comes, and they won that case too. So that it can only happen, and therefore equalise pay a lot more. And it's not just whether you get paid the same as the man who sits next to you, because of government legislation. So my argument is that every step in the process, once the legislation is there, then of course the system can start working to ensure that women get to the right position and get paid properly. But you do need that. Without that push, quite a lot of the improvement that you hail now as sort of wonderful improvement in the way in which women work and progress simply wouldn't have happened.
Well,
So Kate, Kate, can I ask you just to come back on that? Obviously, gender pay gap reporting was suspended this year in view of the fact that you think they're crude statistics that are worse than meaningless, worse than useless. Would you rather that it was never reintroduced?
I would definitely prefer that that was never reintroduced. I think they should take the money that they spend on making large businesses, holding them to account, so to speak, to report their faulty pay gap measures every year and put it towards helping women go through employment tribunals. I think we're setting up a bit of a straw man here. I've never argued against the Equal Pay Act. I don't think that there is absolutely zero role for government to play in society and making sure that people receive fair pay for equal work. But I'm opposed to, what I'm saying is that it has been historically that liberal, free democracies with capitalist systems have led to the huge empowerment and improvement for women that we've seen. And if we're taking that as the baseline, when we talk about bringing in new kinds of regulations, we should be skeptical and we should ask if they're really going to help women. I fear that any more subsidy to childcare is going to make the situation worse for the women who actually need to use it 40, 50 hours a week, then it's actually going to help. I worry that if you bring quotas onto the boards, I can't imagine a way to frankly be more resentful as a man or more offended as a woman to be told that the only way that I can grow in a company is if somebody puts me there because of my gender, because of my sex. And I think I personally would really push back on this idea of pay equality. I mean, you've mentioned a few examples there, and there will always be some examples of pay inequality. The BBC one, I think, is much more murky than that. You had the highest paid professionals, people on salaries that most people can only dream of, taking issue with the fact that they felt they were underpaid compared to what was essentially other top talent. I think top talent is one of the hardest things to actually put value on, especially in an organization like the BBC. And you saw those cases play out, and women should absolutely have the right to go to through an employment tribunal if they feel compelled. But independent analysis of the BBC gender pay gap was actually lower than the average in the UK. It was around 6%. There was not systemic culture of pay inequality at the BBC. There were a few cases at the top when you could compare movie stars, people do with Jennifer Lawrence and the rest. These are very, very difficult, tricky areas, and women who want to push for more pay should absolutely do so. I have no issue with that. But you can't take those examples and say that we just across the board have pay inequality in every sector, in every business. ITV technically has a gender pay gap, but nobody could actually say that Dame McCall, who is the boss of ITV, is systematically underpaid. It's not comparing like for like. These statistics are not remotely comparing like for like. And of course, when you do start breaking down like for like comparisons, and perhaps the only silver lining of these mandatory pay gap measures has been that businesses have been reporting what the government makes them report and then producing their own reports with much fairer analysis, taking into account age and job and background and education. The more you compare, the less of a gender pay gap you see. Sometimes it goes into reverse. So it is, again, not to say that government doesn't have a role. It's not to say that there aren't still unfair aspects of society that we need to tackle. But almost always, there is a more nuanced or a version of the story or another side of the story, and especially when it comes to the gender pay gap. You are having businesses whose reputations are being torn apart, many businesses who do so much to help women, because they're being made to calculate figures that don't compare like for like. So it's not to say that we can't make improvements, we can, but we need to actually target the problem. And I fear at the moment we have failed in many aspects of society to target the problem. Just to very quickly go back to childcare, there's plenty of evidence that it's white middle-class women who are more likely to access traditional forms of childcare. It is not obvious that throwing the state, throwing regulation, and throwing more money at things actually makes it easier for the minority groups that we might like to help more.
Thanks, Kate. Vicky, I'm going to come back to you. I'd like to just pick up on what Kate had said about quotas, which I believe you view as an essential catalyst for progress that is currently moving at glacial speed. Now, here in the UK, a third of all board positions in the UK's FTSE 100 companies are held by women, meaning that a key target of the government-backed Hampton-Alexander Review has been met, was met a year early. But there have been cries of tokenism, and we know that women are disproportionately represented in non-executive director roles. So could I come to you for your views on quotas and why you believe that they are so important to women's progress?
I had thought that quotas for boards might be a good idea, and I did argue that it should be quotas rather than targets, but actually I don't really think that boards make any difference in terms of cultural change that needs to happen in an organisation. And as you pointed out, Annabel, a lot of the women who have come to make up the numbers are non-executive directors who sit on lots of different boards. Many of them come from outside, from abroad. Nothing wrong with that one, originally from abroad. So it's a good earner for them, but it actually makes very little difference to the way in which an organisation is run. And the interesting thing is that the first report of the Hampton-Alexander Review showed very clearly the contempt that chairmen of boards had on needing to have women on it. All sorts of quotes that they published, such as, it's too complicated for many women. Why should they need to bother? Why would they even want to be on the board? It's not the sort of thing that would interest them. And we have one already. Why do we need another one? And so on. My view had been, in fact, I argued this a number of times. Before I wrote my book, I wrote another book called Why Women Need Quotas. It's not really for quotas on boards. It is for quotas for senior positions, which is actually the area that the Hampton-Alexander Review now is looking at. How do you increase the number of women in that position? And my view on quotas is absolutely not, and I think Kate is right to say that the last thing that women want is to be seen to, in fact, a number of women say that, to be seen to be there because they're a token woman. But actually, they are a token woman on boards right now, I'm afraid. You can't get away from that. With targets rather than quotas, so that the companies can show that they've done something. But the interesting thing about my proposal is that you have quotas that have to be met over a period of time by particular sectors. So when you start from very low, like possibly, I don't know whether there are any underwriters in the audience, the underwriting industry may not have very many, slightly better overall in the insurance sector, and so on. So you can start from looking at the sectors and saying that over a period of time you need to be at 30%, 40%, or whatever it is. And what that does is it encourages you to keep your talent and to build the pipeline, because otherwise you lose them. There is absolutely no way at those, if you have to meet that quota, then you can find it immediately by just looking around you, because people won't have had the training, won't have the ability to be there. But by making sure that you've got to do it over a period of time, then you keep your entrants, you give them the more flexible time, you give all that Kate also spoke about, hoping that this will all become more permanent. You encourage job sharing, you train the people, even if they are short, part-time, you train them, which now they get very little training if that's the case. And you ensure that they can move up. Not by discriminating in their favour while you're doing it, but by keeping the pipeline there. Given that women who enter now, and I'm sure Kate will want to say that herself, are better qualified in many ways and enter the professions in larger numbers, for example, in the UK, and then they disappear. If they stay, there's no real reason why you wouldn't choose one of them rather than a man, and then you might choose another man. So by the time that you get to the point where you're appointing the top team, say, below the board, you'd have a bigger choice to make. So you don't say, I'm going to have the woman because I need to meet my target, because by then you'll have loads of men and women to choose from who are equally good. And that's the way this will work. And once you get that process, the cultural change to happen, and I agree with Kate that you don't want too much regulation. In fact, I've always been in favour of not having too much, just you need enough. Then you kill it. So there should be a sunset clause in it. So you just get rid of it, because the system has changed and it's benefited men as well as women. And that's the real thing. There is no real reason why we should have this very long hour culture in particular sectors of the economy. And there's no real reason why men can't contribute a bit more in terms of the house and the children and all that sort of stuff, and shouldn't have more flexibility. I think one of the COVID-19 gains could be that we've learned a different way of working, and that will become something that everyone asks for. If you superimpose it's a regulation to you, or at least an expectation, even for firms that are now getting support, that this is what they need to do in the future, and you institutionalize it, then you'll be fine. But remember, voluntary is not a very good idea. When we headed, and I was there at the time when it was first moved that it would happen, we had voluntary reporting. Nobody reported, and that was the interesting thing. It wasn't, they didn't want to let anyone know what their pay gap was, and when it was made compulsory, that was when the reviews actually started coming up with the data that was needed. I'm not saying it was perfect data, and I agree there with Kate, but nevertheless, it focused the mind, and that's the important thing.
Kate, I'll give you the opportunity to respond.
So, at the heart of this, I still feel like the major disagreement here is that you would like to use aspects of the state to, I think, deal with something that is fundamentally cultural. I just simply don't think it will work. I don't desire it, but I also don't think it will work. You talk about how employers lose women along the way as they as they move up the ladder and there are more and more senior jobs available, there are fewer and fewer women to choose from. They're not being lost. They're not disappearing. They're not going to Japan. We know what they're doing. They're having children. And this is the biological unfairness that we still don't have a medical marvel that we can change to take the weight off us and put it onto the other gender. Women have the babies, and this has such a huge impact, not just on, the 9-month process and raising the kids after, but also just on, an entire way of life, going from being a single person to a person in a partnership to a family. For many women, their priorities won't change very much, but for many women, they will. I completely agree, Vicky, that employers should be striving to make their workplaces as accommodating to women as is possible for that sector. And I don't use that caveat to give them a free pass, but I also recognize that a lot of what I think you're talking about requires a heck of a lot of money. And there is a reason that a lot of businesses can't offer these very generous maternity packages or free childcare. They simply can't afford it. I think it's great that the tech companies are doing it. They're setting a good precedent, but it's just not realistic for many companies or for the state necessarily to provide. I mean, it would be a big trade-off. You'd have to compromise on other things. So what we're again really getting at here is a cultural conflict in which it can be harder to retain women. It can be impossible to retain women because they do change their priorities, and we need to acknowledge that. Some women do, not all. And maybe we're not being honest as women with our partners and the men in our lives about how this balance needs to change. Perhaps that's the hardest conversation of all, but it's not one that the state can have for us. The fact that only 2% of men have taken up shared paternity leave isn't really on the state. They offered it. That's either the fault of partners who the women in their lives want them to do it and they're refusing to, or that's just that couple's choice. I think we need to be a bit more open-minded about where the solution lies, but also where the actual problems lie. And just very quickly on the point about doing quotas by sector and things, I mean, I'm still completely opposed to them because whether it's a board or a senior position, it's just impossible at that point, if you've worked so hard as a woman, to confidently say I did this through my own merit and off my own back, because you still know in the back of your head, as does every worker around you, including those that are now reporting to you, that there was another box that you ticked that your male colleague didn't tick, and it had nothing to do with merit. But I mean, let's look at something like the NHS. The NHS has a pay gap. The NHS has a pay gap despite having some of the strictest pay bans. I mean, you really can't discriminate in the NHS between genders. This comes down to the choices that workers are making as they go through the ranks. And I just think we have to be more honest about those choices, and we have to be more honest about who's going to change things. Because I really don't think that another giveaway from the state or another regulation that's put on business is going to flip the switch. I just don't think it's that simple. And when things are cultural, they never are that simple.
Well, Kate, I'm going to stay with you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. I don't understand why subsidising childcare could be damaging. I mean, I'd suggest that viewers read the IEA 2017 paper, Getting the State Out of Childcare by Len Shackleton and Ryan Bourne. But some might respond to you by saying that if free childcare can mitigate against some of those issues, Should cost really be a barrier? Is it not a price worth paying for gender equality?
Well, I would say that costs are all about priorities. What would you like to fund less? Education once kids are going through school. Would you like to, take money out of the NHS? Do you want taxes to rise? In which case, which ones? That could actually have a deterioration effect on the number of hours that people want to work, the kind of jobs they want to do, depending on what kind of tax you go for. I mean, how are you going to pay for it? One idea that my free market friends probably won't like, but I do think would be interesting to look into, is whether or not you should increase paternity pay. I think increasing paternity pay would make shared parental leave for men more appealing, and it would be an expense, but I'd be willing to compromise in other areas to have that. But again, specifically on childcare, I still think universal free childcare could get you into a lot of trouble, especially the way that the UK does it. We have one of the most regulated systems in all of Europe. The minder to child ratio is so strict that the costs are extremely expensive. And what you do when you continue to subsidize a really, really expensive industry is you create this vicious cycle where you're pouring more money into it, and so it keeps going and it doesn't reform. But you're making the cost for anybody who has to top up their hours or use it on the weekends more expensive. So you're really pricing people out of childcare in many situations. And as I already mentioned, the kinds of people who access it tend to be people who already have a decent amount of money. I mean, they may not be filthy rich, but they tend not to be targeting the poorest in society. So I think when it comes there, I think every free marketeer will have something where they'd like to spend a bit more extra money, and they would be willing to talk about the trade-offs of having to cut elsewhere. Childcare, for me, as it exists now, is not one of them, because it's a very bad system to begin with, and we have to break the cycle.
Vicky, I'll come to you because I'm conscious we're running out of time. But if you'd like to respond on the childcare point, please do feel free. And we do have a question from Mark Littlewood. What would persuade Vicky that there was no longer a problem and that regulation was not needed and could be repealed?
Okay, well, it's interesting on the childcare front. I think it is worth saying that if you, across the world actually, but also surveys that have been done here, suggest, and in Europe, that if there is good childcare that women trust, they're just as keen to go back to work after having the child. That is the vast majority. There will always be a few who prefer to stay at home, but they're just as keen to go back to work, and they will, and they use it. So there have been controlled experiments with local authorities providing childcare in Italy, and the difference that it makes to labour force participation, and then also to the appearance of senior women pretty soon afterwards in various positions, which of course changes the whole culture of, what is it that I can achieve. And of course, childcare costs at present, there are all these regulations, of course, that are there. The regulations exist in Scandinavia and other places as well. But what you could do, of course, is just change the system. It's not you just say no childcare because it's badly done. Certainly, we have not been paying enough for childcare from the state. The reason why it hasn't worked here in terms of the free childcare that's been offered additionally to what the nurseries were providing originally is because they didn't get paid enough per hour for each of or per child. So the government decided to be mean about it. Now, of course, we have discovered a money tree, it seems, or money making tree, which we can use to wipe out National Health Trust deficits. 13.5 billion was the latest. So you just, they all come up. The Treasury now comes up with another sort of scheme that costs. So maybe this is the time to sneak in a proper childcare subsidised scheme, which is paid for by the state. The most important thing about it is that if you work, you don't rely on unemployment benefits. You start paying taxes on national insurance. So over a period of time, it can pay back, or at least it can pay back a certain amount of this, and it is very, very good for women's equality, as we said. So that's my reaction to childcare. It's absolutely, and also women are just as, all the surveys suggest, just as ambitious in terms of achieving in an organization as the men, and then they get frustrated by the obstacles that are out there. So my point is not that we need a constant stream of regulations, but every now and then, if you're moving up a step and you really want to get to the point where when the woman makes the choice to stay at home, she makes the choice because that's really what she wants, not because life is more difficult if she carries on working, then I'll be very happy with that state of affairs. And remember what the IFS has calculated, that when a man has a child, then his income actually goes up for quite some time after. But for a woman, it starts going down and the gap gets bigger and bigger for a good 12 years after the birth of the first child. And to a considerable extent, it's not because they stay at home, it's because they feel they need to be more flexible, or because of the way they're treated at work, and they try and find jobs nearby. So it goes back to what I said about developing countries. With the child, you then look for jobs. The market mechanism doesn't really work. You look for jobs that are closer, so you can be around when sort of childcare facilities stop at a certain time during the day, and you don't have free childcare, or the cost is so great. So your job search is in a much lower geographical area, and it is almost directly correlated, your wage gap, with the difference in the distance of commuting between men and women after a child is born. So what you're doing is you're limiting people's chances already, because there isn't that flexibility and that availability of childcare just there, so that you can carry on and have your work continuing as was before. So you lose out throughout your life, you end up poorer, you end up with less pension in the end, and the power balance that I mentioned at the beginning remains constantly tilted in favour of the men. And I don't think that that is a fair society to live in.
Kate, 1 minute. I know you want to come back. Gender commuting gap, the wage gap increasing to 33%, 12 years after the arrival of the first child. What's your final thought?
Oh, there's no doubt that if the pay gaps that exist in this world are down to motherhood, and that's why I want to move the focus away from employers and more to the cultural side of things. There's plenty of evidence that women do miss out, so to speak, in the long term because they do stay at home. Women on average take years more out of the workforce than men do. And again, this comes down to our schemes and if they're actually working in favor of women, and if the issue is really more regulation or actual societal change. I would just note that when we talk about that childcare will pay for itself, I'm pretty sure that's what we say about HS2 and every grandstanding idea for a government project. So
I would never say that about HS2.
Well, that's
never.
Good to hear. I meet that with
no economist I know is in favour of it. So.
And I'm not completely convinced they found a magic money tree. I think they found a very decent excuse to borrow a heck of a lot of money this year, but this is not hopefully a structural deficit, but a one-off deficit. And we always have to remember when proposing more regulation and more spending, that stays with us for hopefully a much longer period of time than COVID-19 does.
Right, great. Thank you to you both. Thank you everybody for joining. I regret that we don't have longer to discuss these issues. It's been a fascinating debate, in large part thanks to our speakers, Vicky Pryce and Kate Andrews. And it would be remiss of me not to thank all our donors. Whatever sum of money you give enables us to put out this content for free for anyone in the world to watch. If you enjoyed this webinar, I suggest you subscribe to our IEA Daily Bulletin to ensure you never miss an event or broadcast. You can sign up on iea.org.uk. And thank you very much again. Have a very pleasant evening in the sunshine. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Annabel. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you.